Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters. Here's what's coming up for you this week. With two of the world's biggest wheat exporters at war, countries like Egypt, Lebanon and Yemen are left grappling with soaring food prices and fewer grain shipments. Turkey pitches itself as a possible mediator to try and end the conflict in Eastern Europe, but President Erdogan says his friendship with both Kyiv and Moscow must be preserved. We'll be speaking shortly to our Ankara correspondent. And 18 months after Beirut's devastating port blast, we've been to meet some of those still fighting for justice and battling to keep certain physical reminders of the tragedy standing tall. First then, the UN has warned that the conflict in Ukraine has led to the bombing of a breadbasket. Antonio Guterres says urgent action is needed to help the most vulnerable far away from this war zone, amid fears the fighting could well trigger what he calls a hurricane of hunger. Lebanon and Egypt are some of the biggest purchasers of wheat from Russia and Ukraine, but that supply line has now been massively disrupted. Catherine Kadir-Clifford reports.
Despite their distance to Ukraine, Egypt and Lebanon are feeling the squeeze. Ukraine and Russia produce almost a third of world wheat and barley exports, and the war is cutting their clients off from their usual supply. Lebanon depends on Ukraine for 50% of its wheat and on Russia for 12%. Its current reserves are all the more limited after the explosion at Beirut's port in 2020, which destroyed the country's main grain storage structure. In spite of all this, the economy minister sought to plant a grain of optimism.
We do not have a shortage of wheat. We have enough to last a month and a half.
Between the economic crisis and these supply problems, food shortages seem unavoidable for the Lebanese. Though likely not as quickly, the Egyptians too will feel the strain of the war on their plates. They're the world's greatest bread consumers, eating 4 times more than even the French. However, the country grows only 40% of the wheat it requires on home soil. Out of 60% of imports, 85% come from Ukraine or Russia. But Egyptian authorities insist they have enough supplies to feed the country.
From mid-April, we'll start the local wheat harvesting season, and I assure all Egyptians that we won't have any crisis whatsoever, or be forced to buy from the international market until the end of this year.
The government also plans to plant more at home, though it will be months before harvest time. A third of the Egyptian population lives on less than €2 per day. Petrol, electricity and bread are subsidised for 60% of the population, who can buy bread at a 95% discount. Despite soaring wheat prices, the government is reluctant to raise the price of bread.
In 2010, there was a major heatwave in Russia, which resulted in an embargo on grain exports. So they decided not to export any more wheat, and also not to send out any of the boats that were already sold. It sparked the same panic as we're seeing at the moment. Buyers turned to those who still had grain to sell, Western Europe and the United States, and prices rocketed within a few days.
It's risky territory. It was the spark that set off the bread riots in 1977 and again lit the Arab Spring in 2011 with the slogan, "Bread, Freedom, Social Justice."
Well, Turkey has been one of the many countries calling for calm in Ukraine. President Erdogan says his government will relentlessly try and find a long-lasting ceasefire. And Turkey has already hosted the first high-level peace talks between the Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers. But Ankara is walking something of a tightrope. That's because it's traditionally a friend of Ukraine and has been supplying drones to its ally. But it also depends on Russia for things like gas. For more on this, we can speak now to our correspondent, Jasper Mortimer. Jasper, it seems that Turkey is sending mixed signals somewhat. Just what is Turkey's position and policy on this war?
Turkey's policy is to support Ukraine, but at the same time not to antagonize Russia, with which it has strong economic ties. Its support for Ukraine takes 3 forms. It's selling military drones to Ukraine, and it's also training Ukrainian drone operators It's sending humanitarian aid. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said it had sent 50 trucks of aid to Ukraine. And it has criticized Russia's offensive as unjust and a violation of international law. At the same time, it's trying not to fall out with Russia. It's refused to impose sanctions on Russia. Russia is Turkey's biggest source of natural gas and of wheat. It's also Turkey's biggest source of tourists. 5 million tourists, Russian tourists, came to Turkey last year. At the same time, it's making political gestures. Turkey abstained on a motion in the Council of Europe against Russia. Turkey hosted the Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers for trilateral talks with the Turkish foreign minister in Antalya last Thursday. So basically, Turkey is performing a balancing act, but it's leaning more to the Ukrainian side.
And Jasper, when President Erdogan has to make a decision on this conflict, what do you think is uppermost in his mind?
Certainly the elections in June next year. All the polls say that if elections were held this Sunday, he would lose. And the cause of that is the state of the economy, where inflation is officially over 50%. Unofficially, it's more than 120%. Now, Erdogan has 15 months to turn the economy around. However, the Ukrainian war is going to make that a lot more difficult. The war is driving up the price of energy, and it will certainly have an effect on the price of wheat. And these things will affect the pockets of Turkish voters. I think the second thing in Erdogan's mind is that he has long wanted to improve relations with President Joe Biden. His problem with Biden goes back to the days when Biden was vice president under Barack Obama. Erdogan and Biden had a spat in those days, which Biden has never forgotten. Hours after the meeting between the Ukrainian and Russian foreign ministers in Antalya, Erdogan phoned Biden and asked Biden to lift what he called the unjust sanctions on military trade with Turkey. When a journalist asked Erdogan if he would go ahead with buying more S-400 anti-aircraft missiles from Russia, the first batch of which, when Turkey purchased those, caused America to impose the military sanctions against Turkey. Erdogan said it's premature to talk about a second deal of S-400s. And I'm sure what his rationale is that he hopes the Antalya meeting has improved Turkey's standing in President Biden's eyes. And he doesn't want to spoil that by doing more military trade with Russia.
Jasper Mortimer, our correspondent in Ankara, thank you very much. Moving on, he's out of jail, but he's not out of the country. The relief that's been felt following the release of the Saudi blogger Raif Badawi has been tinged with dismay. The 38-year-old spent a decade behind bars for insulting Islam, but now faces a 10-year travel ban. And in a separate development, a record 81 people have been executed in a single day by Saudi Arabia for terrorism-related crimes. Human Rights Watch says it's highly unlikely that the mainly Shiite men received a fair trial. Now, in times of grief, many people look for consolation in a place of worship or at the final resting place of a loved one. But for relatives of those who died in the 2020 Beirut port explosion, the colossal grain silos which shielded several neighbourhoods from the full extent of that blast have become a source of solace that they want to protect. Our bureau in Lebanon has sent us this.
A year and a half after the Beirut port blasts, the grain silos continue to stand tall amid the rubble, their symbolic outline recalling the tragic events of August 4th, 2020. William Noon, whose brother was found under the ruins, comes here to reflect from time to time. He has both his brother's portrait and the silos tattooed on his arm. William stands against the Lebanese authorities' plan to replace them.
The silos are as important to us as the investigation. They represent collective memory. You pass them and you remember. Anyone can see what happened by looking at them. If they're destroyed, people will forget.
Williams sees this as yet another fight he has to take in the journey towards truth and justice.
We're confronting the authorities. So far, nothing has happened. The silos must remain in place at all costs, and if they attempt to demolish them, we will stop them.
100 meters away from the port, the Najjar's apartment overlooks the grain silos. To justify their demolition, the Lebanese government says they will collapse soon. However, this couple, who lost their daughter on August 4th, are not convinced by this argument.
These silos and this part of the port that you can see should remain a dedication to the victims of the 4th of August. It's not a place for them to rebuild their business, let's be frank. It's hurtful to us.
The families of the victims fear the investigation will be buried, as it hasn't progressed for months. To keep the memory of their loved ones alive, they want to establish a memorial in front of the silos to pay tribute to the 200 victims of the blasts and finally be able to properly mourn their loss.
And we end this edition on a cultural note in the UAE. Art Dubai is the biggest modern art fair in the Middle East, and this 15th edition has seen over 100 local and foreign art dealers come and share and peruse. And for the very first time, the show features a set of digital artworks with one section dedicated to galleries and platforms selling non-fungible tokens. That's all from me and the rest of the Middle East Matters team. Thanks for watching, and do stay tuned to France 24.
Join us every day here on France 24 for the last stretch of the presidential race, the mother of all election, the presidential election. This is the time for the French to choose their president. We'll have all our special envoys on the campaign trail across the globe, the latest analysis, the best polls. Join us here on France 24.
France 2022, the campaign on France 24 and France24.com.